Hey guys, Mrs. Fox here with part two of your 7.1 flipped classroom. So if you haven't watched part one yet, back up, stop, go watch part one and join us when you are ready for part two. For those of you guys that are in the right place, we were on question 5, talking about strengths and weaknesses. Okay, it looks like the North has a lot more things going for it, and it does, and ultimately those things will help us to win, but the South had a lot of heart going into this because, the war drags on for 4.5 years. Okay, so what does the North have going for it? Looking at population, by sheer numbers, has over twice again as many people in it than the South does. Plus, if you take into consideration that a third of the population in the South are slaves, then definitely for fighting people that are possible to, join the military for these fights for North or South, the North has more going for it. Okay. A lot of the factories are there in the North. This is going to help them for a few reasons. One, they're self-sufficient. They have finished products, right? Because that's what factories are doing. They're creating out of raw materials finished products. So they have these finished products that they have, on hand. The South only has about 15% of the nation's factories, so they have less ability to do that. Not to mention, this is a very common thing to take place during wartime, okay, or during a health pandemic or crisis, is you take a factory that exists already and you make them produce something else that you have a need for. So it's common during wartime to have a factory halt production of whatever they normally make, and hey, you guys are going to make guns instead, right? And or other materials or weapons or medicines or masks or whatever it is that we need, right? And so the North had that advantage because they had the infrastructure in place to do that. Additionally, I know you guys have been taught all year long, you've had it pounded into your brain that the South is where the farming takes place and the North had rocky soil and they weren't big on farming. It's true that the South definitely has an economy based on farming, but it's not edible products that are going to keep their bellies full, guys. They made cash crops, okay? They made, cotton and tobacco and things like that. That's not going to help feed their armies when they're out marching from place to place. The North, they have food-based farming where there is farming. And remember, the North is originally the New England colonies and the middle colonies together. And if you remember, the middle colonies, they didn't have farming so bad. There's the breadbasket colonies. Remember that from the beginning of the year? They're still called that breadbasket belt. A lot of the carbohydrate type of things, wheat and grains and rice and stuff would grow in that middle area that is part of the Union. Plus they had, independent farming to feed families and stuff. No, it wasn't plantation-sized farms, but they do have, food farming throughout the Union. So they've got that. They have over double the railroad line that's going to get troops and supplies to places faster. They have more telegraph, so getting things, to different people, messages and plans and, routes you should take and all that stuff. Information, right, is going to pass easier in the North. They have more ports and naval support and shipyards and naval power than the South does. They have more natural resources with, forests with wood and all the things you could chop down trees for and use that stuff for. And plus you have Abraham Lincoln. That is not to be underestimated. Abraham Lincoln, obviously one of, if not the most famous president we've ever had, has his faults just like everybody else and makes mistakes just like everybody else, but ultimately changes this country's path forever and is an amazing and brilliant leader. He grows into that role as he goes along, but he, has a legacy of being one of the most brilliant leaders in all of the world ever. So the Union has that going for them. All right, looking at the Confederacy or the South, again, they have less people, and part of that population is slaves. They have less factories. They don't have as much railroad or telegraph line. They don't have as many farms that produce food because they were all making cash crops. But they do have some things going for them. One of the things is that the North really actually starts off with not very strong military leaders, and that's a big deal, right? Whereas the South has some strong, right off the bat, amazing generals and military strategists, such as Robert E. Lee that we talked about already. Okay. The other thing is they're fighting a defensive war. Okay. They're fighting their homes. They're fighting for their way of life. They're not fighting their homes. They're fighting for their homes, sorry, and their way of life. They're fighting, for the safety of their farms and their land and stuff. That gives you a certain amount of motivation that the North doesn't have, right? They're not fighting for their homes and their way of life and their rights that they're passionate about, right? The South is on the defense. And a lot of times when you're on the defense, it gives you more of a passion, more of a heart, more of a hunger to win, right? So you can't underestimate that. And also, if you're in the North, most of the fighting throughout the war, almost all of it, will take place in the South. So you have to get all of the men and all of the supplies and all of the food and the weapons and everything down to the South all the time. That in of itself was a huge undertaking and wore people out and cost money. Whereas the South, they're already there. They have home field advantage. They know the land better. They're there already. They don't have to travel as far. Okay, so there's some pros and cons of the North and the South. If you need more time, push pause because we're moving on. So draw a line underneath everything you just wrote all the way across your page. Some graphics for you guys to look at for you visual people out there. Again, blue is the Union. That's the North, right? Anti-slavery, pro-tariffs. Looking at it, they win almost all the way across the board, right? The red in the four corners is what I'm talking about now, is the South. So they have less of like everything on paper, all right? You would think this war would have been super quick, but it wasn't because the South was mad and they had heart about wanting their way. Looking at the middle one, that just kind of gives you an idea of slaves and how slavery was working. Remember, the Union side has slaves too because those border states have slavery. So that was always something Lincoln had to balance. Like, he didn't want the border states to leave and go join the Confederacy. So when he talked about slavery or things he was going to adjust or, try to do to end slavery, for a long time he was, walking on a tightrope because you didn't want to tick the border states off that had slaves. All right, so taking that in, there you go, there you go. Another graphic just kind of showing you guys some things there. On the one on the left, the South is in gray, the North is in blue. Again, almost always the blue, the North, the Union is winning, except for cotton. Wow, what's cotton going to get you? Really? Is it important? Yeah. Is it as important as food? No, right? Okay, and just another graphic to kind of show you how things lie. Okay, so pause that if you want to look at it longer because here we go. Q6 Union, which is the North, their strategy. What is it? All right, well, the strategy in the North is that really they want the southern states to come back into the Union. All right, a house divided against itself will not stand, right? They need to come back together. They're stronger together. And so the North is looking to get the South to stop having their tantrum and come on back and be part of the United States again. So their plan to do that is a naval blockade because they have a much stronger navy than the South does, all across the southern coastline, cutting off the South's ability to do any import or exporting, right? Which because they grow cotton is a big part of their economy, selling that cotton off to Europe and other places. So if we cut you off from being able to get supplies or sell anything, right? Hopefully you're going to cave, you're going to cry uncle and come back to the Union. This plan is called the Anaconda Plan. It's designed by a guy named Winfield Scott. And it's called the Anaconda Plan, like the big anaconda snake, because they looked at it like circling around those southern states and squeezing its prey until they cut them off from everything. And, they're begging to come back kind of a thing. So really to do that, you needed to go block them all the way around the Atlantic Ocean, right, all the way through, and then come up around the backside where it was just territories and then cut off the Mississippi. If you could come back around and cut them off at the Mississippi River, you were going to split the Confederacy into two. And if you could get them to split into two and take control of that Mississippi River, it's easier to take out, two smaller opponents sometimes than one big opponent. So that was the Anaconda Plan, and that is the Northern strategy. If you need more time, push pause, because here we go. There is kind of a popular illustration that ran at the time of what it's called Scott's Great Snake, right? Because General Scott came up with the Anaconda Plan, and you can kind of see where it's getting its name from. Again, it's going all the way around that ocean, right? And then they wanted to come up, cut them off from any territories over here, and split them in two by taking over control of that Mississippi River there. So that is the North's plan, their strategy to win the Civil War. Okay? There's some video clips, of course, for you, so watch those. Take advantage of those. They're on the Flipped Classroom homepage, okay, or a link there to get to them is. Well, what about the South? What is the South strategy? One thing the South had going for it is it didn't have what would have been the monumental task of trying to conquer the North. They're not trying to take over the United States. That's actually hugely in their favor that they don't have to do that. All they want is independence. They just want to break away and be left alone so that they could be the Confederate States of America, where slavery is allowed and tariffs were not going to be, and state rights were big and bad and had more power than the federal government was going to have. They just want to be left alone. Okay, so the Southern strategy had 3 parts. Okay, 3-part plan for the South. Pay attention. All right, number 1 is, hey, they recognize the North is trying to blockade them in with the Anaconda Plan. So we need to figure out a way to break the blockade, okay? Obviously. So step 1, try to break up the blockade. Step 2, the South was very confident going into this war that they were going to be able to get themselves allies because they produce cotton, right? The South has over half of the world's cotton supply, and they really thought that Europe and other places really wanting to always buy this cotton from them would win them allies. Hey, we're going to withhold cotton from you or raise prices or whatever if you don't offer your assistance to us. And so they thought this was genius going in, that of course they're going to get European backing from multiple countries willing to back the Confederacy. Not the case though. As it happened, bad luck for the South. Maybe it would have gone different under different circumstances, but the way that it happened was when they say, hey, we're withholding cotton unless you come join us, Europe actually had a surplus at that time, which happened from time to time. They had a surplus, and they look over at the South and they're like, yeah, we don't need your cotton, and we don't really want to get involved in this American war. Go solve your own problems. And so they ultimately don't actually end up acquiring any allies. But that was a part of their plan because they thought that they would be able to get allies. This is going to be one of the big reasons that's going to ultimately factor into them losing, is they didn't get any support. The third thing was they really felt that if they could go up to Washington, D.C., which is the United States of America's capital, right, and they could sack the capital, they could take it over, it would be such a blemish and embarrassment on the North and show real power play by the South that the North would have to throw their hands up and say, okay, give us back our capital, fine, you guys can walk away, peace be with you, peace out, okay? And they would leave the South alone. So the Southern strategy, 3-part plan. Part 1, break up the Anaconda Plan blockade of waterways. Part 2, get themselves some allies, which doesn't happen. And part 3, let's go try to conquer the capital because we want to get our paws on that. And they, in their mind, thought that would force the North to have to cave. Okay. By the way, the Confederate capital, it was on a few slides back, ends up becoming Richmond, Virginia, FYI. Okay. So Confederate capital, Confederate States of America, has Richmond, Virginia as their capital. All right. So we've got the first major battle. Remember, we had Fort Sumter already take place, but the first major battle where deaths actually occur is at a place called Manassas, and it ends up being known as the First Battle of Bull Run. So what happens is Lincoln orders an invasion of Richmond, Virginia, because it's the capital, like I was just telling you guys, of the Confederacy, because he has the same thought. Like, if we take down their capital, they're going to have to say, white flag, just kidding, we're done, right? So he wants to take over Richmond. And so he wants to send an army down there to do that. But in order to get down to Richmond, on the way down there, they've got to defeat the Confederate troops in their way that are stationed at a town called Manassas, Virginia. And so this first battle is going to take place in Manassas, and it's going to be called Bull Run. We'll talk about that in part 3. I'll see you then.